Don't let anybody make you think that God chose America as his divine messianic force to be a sort of policeman of the whole world. God has a way of standing before the nations with judgment, and it seems that I can hear God saying to America, "You are too arrogant. And if you don't change your ways, I will rise up and break the backbone of your power."
Hotep, which in the language of ancient Egypt means we come with justice in peace. Welcome to Freedom Now, a Saturday Pan-Africanist and Internationalist World Affairs program. Freedom Now is committed to the principle of the rights of all peoples and nations to self-determination. We thank you deeply for your contribution to KPFK, which permits programs like Freedom Now to stay on the air. In this era of corporate acquisition and co-optation of all dissident media, we provide the microphone, challenging their corporate and racist point of view. So stay tuned for our agenda here at Freedom Now.
Fellas, I'm ready to get up and do my thing. I want to get into it, man, you know.
Peace, hoteps, and wisdom to all of our faithful and devoted listeners out there in the radio verse. This is Brother Brandon Sankara, and I want to start things off with a thank you to all of you listeners out there who continue to support Freedom Now through this latest season of Fund Drive. You keep us on our mission and allow us to bring you our agenda for today, Saturday, April 26, 2025. We have two great interviews with our very own treasure trove of wisdom, author, historian, and professor of African American Studies at the University of Houston, as well as Freedom Now co-producer Dr. Gerald Horne, who's being joined first on the line by Scott W. Stern, author of the book There is a Deep Brooding in Arkansas, the rape trials that sustained Jim Crow and the people who fought it, from Thurgood Marshall to Maya Angelou. After that, Dr. Horne will be in conversation with Christina Greene, Professor Emerita at the University of Wisconsin at Madison, and author of the book Free Joan Little, The Politics of Race, Sexual Violence, and Imprisonment. It's yet another packed hour of knowledge you can only get right here on KPFK 90.7 FM. So let's hear from KPFK's very own Gary Baca about why you should support us here at Freedom Now and KPFK.
Once again, we're back for Freedom Now, 818-985-5735. We're in our fund drive, our spring fund drive, and it lasts only 2 weeks. If you haven't pledged for Freedom Now, this program hosted by Dr. Gerald Horne, please call now and pledge your support for this incredible historian. 818-985-5735. Gerald Horne holds the John J. and Rebecca Morris Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. In 1992, Horne was a candidate for the U.S. Senate on the Peace and Freedom Party ticket. He has published exclusively on W.E.B. Du Bois and has written books on neglected episodes of world history, including Hawaii and the Pacific. He writes about topics he perceives as misrepresented struggles for justice, in particular, communist struggles and struggles against imperialism, colonialism, fascism, racism, and white supremacy. Much of his work highlights and analyzes specific individuals in their historic contexts, such as Lawrence Dennis, a man described as the brains behind American fascism. 818-985-5735, 818-985-KPFK, and your dollars go to support this programming, the programs here on KPFK, future programs, and the training of youth here at KPFK for the next generation. You are bringing KPFK into the future by calling 818-985-5735, 818-985-KPFK. Currently, I'm training young people. Just recently, I spoke at a high school for young kids in media relations at Dorsey High School in Los Angeles. It was an hour class, and I told the youth how important the media is to the community and my struggle in getting to where I'm at now. I believed in this station so much that I would do anything, and I'm still like that to this day. I would do anything for this station to keep it alive. I'm a yes man. Whenever I get a request or someone needs help here at the station, I always say yes, or always find a way to make it happen. And I think that's why some of us are so valuable, is that we're not no men. We don't say, nope, can't do it. And believe me, there's people here at Pacifica that did that are no longer here. They were just like, no, we can't do that. No, we can't broadcast from there. No, we can't make it happen. No, we don't have the dollars. No, we don't have the equipment. You know, that was said, and it was accepted. And it's still accepted to this day because we are on a budget, on limited funds. But if we can try to make it happen with hard work, dedication, volunteering, putting our time into it, we can make it happen. Not everything is about money. This is blood, sweat, and tears. If you believe in that statement, if there was a way that you can put your money into activism, here it is. 818-985-5735. We're in for the big fight. These 3.5 years are going to be tough, but we're going to be right here with you. 818-985-5735 and pledge your support at any amount. $25 to Dr. Gerald Horne and Freedom Now would be appreciated. Imagine if we could get at least 10 of you to pledge $25. That would be over $200. 818-985-5735. Imagine pledging $200 and we can make a match out of that. You can challenge someone else who listens to Freedom Now to pledge $200. If you pledge that $200, we can make $400 and double our money. 818-985-5735. 818-985-KPFK. Let me say it slowly. 818-985-KPFK or pledge online at kpfk.org. Now back to Freedom Now.
Now that you've decided to make your pledge, I want to remind you that I'm going to be on the ones and twos as we pour this knowledge, making sure your mental cup runneth over with revolutionary wisdom right here to quench your mental thirst on Freedom Now. KPFK 90.7 FM in Los Angeles and kpfk.org, streaming live on the web. To make sure we stay on the smooth ride with that cultural vibe you know and love, we'll be enjoying a musical bottom featuring Jimmy Cliff, Dizzy Gillespie, Cannonball Adderley, Pharoah Sanders, Benny Golson, and Miles Davis. Now people get ready for this train to come and taking you one step closer to mental liberation, and stay tuned for this interview with Dr. Gerald Horne and Scott W. Stern.
For Pacifica Radio, KPFK Los Angeles, this is Gerald Horne, and with me on the line is Scott W. Stern, author of the book, There Is a Deep Brooding in Arkansas, the rape trials that sustained Jim Crow and the people who fought it from Thurgood Marshall to Maya Angelou. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Scott W. Stern.
Thank you so much for having me.
So why did you produce this book, There Is a Deep Brooding in Arkansas?
Yeah, so this is a book that arose from a really amazing archive. Like 7 years ago in the summer of 2018, I was doing some unrelated research and I needed a case file, the records of a criminal trial from Arkansas in the 1920s. And I reached out to a bunch of archivists in Arkansas, and eventually I was put in touch with folks at the University of Arkansas at Little Rock. And they initially said, oh, they don't have it. But then they said, actually, not only do they have the trial transcript and a bunch of the briefs for that case, but they had thousands of other transcripts. And I was kind of stunned by this source base. Trial transcripts contain the words of people that don't often survive in the archive. Working class people, marginalized people, often even illiterate people. And my first book had been based on trial transcripts. So I thought for a long time about what I might do with these documents. And I thought about some books I had read that argued that the civil rights movement arose in large part from the work of largely unknown Black female activists, including Rosa Parks, although many others whose names we don't know, resisting sexual violence. And I decided to look at these, this massive database of transcripts and try to better understand the the thing that Rosa Parks and others were protesting against before a mass movement was possible.
Mm-hmm. So what are the details of these cases in Mississippi County, Arkansas, that you write about?
So I write about 2 trials in particular, but I draw from over 100 case files. So that's, 20,000 or so pages of legal documents. And I'm looking primarily at cases in the 1920s and 1930s. And this is the era of Jim Crow, of separate but equal, of pretty rigid and quite violently enforced racial and, to a large extent, economic segregation. But the 2 trials that are at the heart of the book both took place in Mississippi County right as the nation entered the Great Depression. Mississippi County is in northeast Arkansas in the Mississippi River Delta, former swampland, and when the swamps were drained, it became some of the most fertile soil really in the U.S., so it was a very, very important site for agriculture, big cotton plantations. And so the 2 trials that I'm looking at, all of the defendants and really everyone involved were deeply enmeshed in cotton production in this productive part of Arkansas. So the first case involved 2 young white men, Frank Bethel and Mike Wallace, the first a barber, the second a farmer, and they were both accused of rape by a young white school teacher named Pearl. And the second case involved 2 black men, Bubbles Clayton and Jim X. Carruthers. They were both farmers, and they were accused by a young white laborer named Virgie of rape. And the basic story that I tell is what happened in these trials. And what I found was that at every point, arrest, trial, post-trial, they faced starkly disparate treatment. When Bethel and Wallace were arrested, they were eating a midnight snack, and so they were allowed to finish their sandwiches before they were hauled off to jail. When the 2 black men, Clayton and Carruthers, were arrested, they were beaten within an inch of their lives and then nearly lynched. And so the sort of broader argument that I make in the book and use these trials to exemplify is that the legal system in the Jim Crow South, and in particular the law surrounding rape, was not really about discovering who was innocent and who was guilty. It was about determining who had violated the ironclad racial, gender, and economic hierarchies that governed the Jim Crow South. This was about who deserved violence.
Now, was Mississippi County, Arkansas unique in that regard, with regard to a comparison with Arkansas in general, with regard to neighboring states such as Mississippi and Tennessee, Texas, etc.?
I don't know if it was unique, but I do think in many respects it was more extreme. Mississippi County was literally the most productive cotton county in the world. It produced this one county in northeast Arkansas produced almost 2% of the entire world's cotton, and was home to literally the largest plantations in the country, including the very largest, which was controlled by a man named Robert E. Lee Wilson. Also at this time, and this is in northeast Arkansas, not just in Mississippi County, but in this whole Delta region. This was a site of fierce labor struggle at the precise moment that the 2 trials I'm narrating took place. So something called the Southern Tenant Farmers Union emerged, and this was thousands and thousands of poor tenant farmers and sharecroppers who were, in effect, rising up against the rich plantation owners. This was also a place where, to a more extreme degree than in many other places in the South, the rich planters they were rising up against controlled the entire legal apparatus. The planters, would basically rig elections by voting convict laborers, forcing, people whose lives they controlled to vote for the candidates they wanted. The planters actually had their own faux court systems where they would have quote unquote judges, and people who were accused of committing crimes on the plantation would be tried on the plantation, not in a court of law, but just by the planters. And then if they were found quote unquote guilty, they would be forced to work for free for the planter. And so the degree of extremity with which all this labor struggle, the racial stratification, and just how much money was at stake, I think makes the hierarchy and the violence with which it was enforced, it makes it so much starker. It brings it into greater relief.
So on the one hand, these rape trials, as you suggest, were intended to uphold certain hierarchies. On the other hand, you had operating in parallel the Southern Farmers Tenant Union. Should we infer that in part these trials were meant to disrupt labor organizing, particularly, I assume, across racial lines?
Yes, I think that, I think that the role of these trials needs to be understood against a broader history of racial and economic violence and gendered violence in the Jim Crow South. And so for, the better part of a century, there had been very little formal legal system in rural places in the South, like Mississippi County. And in the late 19th century, you start seeing a huge, really especially after the Civil War, you see this huge rise in lynching. In the early 20th century, places like Mississippi County were becoming much more integrated with the northern manufacturing economy and with the global market for cotton. And so they wanted to project to the world that they were not some like lawless, backward place, but that instead this was a modern, well-oiled, functioning place. And so you see this stark drop-off in the number of lynchings and in extra-legal violence in general. And at the same time, you see this sharp increase in criminal trials, especially for crimes like rape. And so cases that previously, allegations that previously would have led to a swift lynching now led to a trial in many cases, although there was always kind of the background threat of lynching. And so I say this to sort of point out the role that these trials played in the Jim Crow society. They weren't really about determining who was innocent and who was guilty. They were instead about providing the facsimile of law and order in order to give the impression that this was not a lawless place. And so a lot of historians have noted that criminal punishments became much, much harsher with the decline of lynchings, and that the number of trials actually increased as the number of lynchings went down. And so these trials should properly be understood as attempts at maintaining this social order of Jim Crow by another name. And so, the Clayton and Carruthers trial, this was these two black men who were accused of rape. This really, I found considerable evidence that these men were not guilty, but rather that they were being made an example of by those in positions of power, which is to say the wealthy white planters and their allies in government, in order to try to strike fear in the heart of the workers, to say that, if you step out of line, this is what's going to happen. We're going to falsely accuse you of a heinous crime, and then we're going to, using all the legal means at our disposal, make sure that we put you in the electric chair.
Now, when I think of Arkansas today, I think of Walmart and Bentonville, Arkansas. I think of Purdue Chicken. I think of Hope, Arkansas, associated with former President William Jefferson Clinton. Are there any echoes with regard to those previous stories, or are they in another part of the state?
Well, so those most of the sort of modern huge corporations that arose in Arkansas are in a different part of the state, although Hope is actually relatively nearby. But, I do think that this history echoes in a number of ways. One is that many of the legal precedents that emerged from Jim Crow rape trials are still on the books. And many of the legal customs that became routine in these trials, such as invoking a woman's sexual history to cast doubt on her accusation, remain commonplace, even though they're now against the law. And obviously a self-described sexual assailant is again the U.S. president. But at the same time, I think, there are these really remarkable echoes of the solidarity and the resistance that I also write a lot about in the book. So, a number of the organizers in the Southern Tenant Farmers Union fought to free Clayton and Carruthers, these two black men, from prison, recognizing their persecution as inseparable from attempts to crush the rights of workers. And they wrote about this very explicitly in, labor newspapers like the Daily Worker. And the Southern Tenant Farmers Union is a really interesting example of the way that this history kind of resounds, where it was pretty affirmatively crushed in Arkansas just a few years after these trials. So by the late 30s, basically all of the union's leaders were either underground or they had to flee the state. Many of them fled west And they ended up in California, where they start to organize agricultural workers, including in grape growing plantations in California. And eventually, one of their new members is a young man named Cesar Chavez. And so the Southern Tenant Farmers Union eventually became the United Farm Workers, one of the most important labor unions in the 20th century. And so this is this way that, what originally was a struggle for the rights of poor, disproportionately Black, poor farmers in Arkansas became part of a nationwide labor struggle. And that kind of struggle and that kind of solidarity is another thing that, continues to persist through this day alongside the repressive parts of this history that also persist.
So who was Maya Angelou, and what role does she play in your story?
So Maya Angelou is one of the most important writers and poets of the late 20th century. She's probably best known for her memoir, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, which came out in the first days of 1970, but she wrote many other poems, and people may know her for reading a poem at the inauguration of Bill Clinton. She comes up quite frequently in There Was a Deep Brooding in Arkansas, because at the exact moment that Bethel and Wallace and Clayton and Carruthers were fighting their legal battles, Maya Angelou was a young girl living in Arkansas, although across the state in a small town called Stamps. And when she was about 8 years old in the mid-1930s, she was raped by her mother's boyfriend. She testified against him at trial and then returned to Arkansas to recover, and for years was so traumatized by the assault and by the trial that she literally couldn't speak. And much of the story that I tell is what happened afterward. Angelou's decision decades later to take what had happened to her and write about it in her first book, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. I think I was the first researcher to see her archival papers when they opened in January 2020. And part of what I saw was her first drafts. And I was really struck by the fact that in writing Caged Bird, she initially didn't write much about the rape. She wrote about her later years. But as she was writing, she decided to put the assault front and center. And she later told interviewers she did this to empower survivors of sexual violence, especially other Black girls. Tell them, and I'm going to quote here, "You might encounter defeats, but must never be defeated." So Maya Angelou provides a perspective on sexual assault trials and their aftermaths that I couldn't glean from trial transcripts alone. What it was like for a woman or a girl involved in these trials, and how these trials would affect women and girls for the rest of their lives.
And who was Thurgood Marshall, and what role does he play in your story?
So Thurgood Marshall is probably best known as the first Black justice on the U.S. Supreme Court. And he was, before that, a trailblazing, civil rights lawyer. He was the first head of the NAACP's Legal Defense Fund. And before that was a very important lawyer for the NAACP. He's basically the guy who who argued Brown v. Board of Education, which struck down separate but equal, the sort of governing legal principle at the heart of Jim Crow. He comes into this story at a much earlier part of his life. Right after he graduates from law school, he's struggling to make a living, and he's slowly getting more involved in the NAACP. And he gets involved in the defense of Clayton and Carruthers. So, he called their case, quote, one of the worst we have yet seen. It was a case that I would argue did make an impact on him, although was not something that he spent a lot of time on. But his efforts on the part of Clayton and Carruthers are part of a story about how their case in particular became a national scandal, and the way that it was metabolized by civil rights activists to try to illustrate the injustice of the legal system in the Jim Crow South.
Finally, Scott Stern, author of the book There Is a Deep Brooding in Arkansas. What was the outcome with regard to Clayton and Carruthers and the other defendants who were accused of rape in Arkansas?
So all four of these men are convicted of rape and sentenced to death. But what ultimately happens to them is very different. And so I narrate their arrest, their imprisonment, the trials, everything that happens, and I try to weave in details from hundreds of other trials. I don't want to say exactly what happened to Bethel and Wallace and Clayton and Carruthers, except to add that they did ultimately face very, very different outcomes. And I also do want to add that I sort of go through the evidence and talk about the fact that I think Bethel and Wallace were very likely guilty, these two white men, whereas Clayton and Carruthers, the two black men, were very likely innocent. And I write about coming to know several of the descendants of Jim X. Carruthers, and these descendants have done a remarkable amount of research into their ancestors, and they've passed down through the generations a very convincing theory for why, of all the poor black sharecroppers in Mississippi County, Jim X in particular and his friend Bubbles were targeted and arrested. And so I won't say exactly what happened to them, but folks can probably intuit, what might have happened to folks at this time and place. And they really did face very different outcomes.
Well, Scott W. Stern, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there, but thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
(818-985-5735). You are listening to Freedom Now with Dr. Gerald Horne. Gerald Horne is one of the most gifted and insightful historians on racial matters of this generation. When we talk about Dr. Horne, many of his books use an individual as a prism to inspect the historical forces of their times. Horne has also produced broad canvas chronicles of infrequently examined periods and aspects of the history of white supremacy and imperialism. For example, he has written on the post-Civil War involvement of the U.S. ruling class, slavery in Brazil, which was not legally abolished until 1888. He has also written on the historic relationships between African Americans and the Japanese in the mid-20th century, specifically examining the ways in which the Japanese state gained sympathy and solidarity from people of color by positioning themselves as the leaders of a global war against white supremacy. 818-985-5735, 818-985-KPFK, or pledge online at kpfk.org. You get your history lesson right here. It's like being in class. You learn so much, and there's no fee. That's the great thing about it, right? You can learn so much from KPFK. It's like being in a class. While some folks spend thousands on education, you get your education right here on KPFK. 818-985-5735, and go ahead and pledge at any amount and say, you know what, I've learned something. Let me give you guys $40. Let me give you guys $100. Let me give you a $250 pledge so that way someone could match that and we can make $500. 818-985-5735. Call that number. And it's very special for someone to be on the mic and to historically take us back and take the time to tell us these facts, these stories about history that some of us want us to forget. But I don't really believe that. People criticize all the time on why we are bringing up the past. Well, if you don't know the past, you don't know the future. You can't repeat what has happened before, such as what Trump is doing now. He's repeating the past. All these dictators, all these oligarchs, the people that don't care about the middle class or poor, homeless, they're right now in office. 818-985-5735. Folks trying to make a better life for themselves, escaping abuse, escaping gangs, drugs, and they come here so they could be in solidarity with us and make this country a better place to live. We're trying. And if you're there, right there with us, thank you so much. We applaud you because we're one and the same, fighting the fight, fighting oligarchy. 818-985-5735, 818-985-KPFK. And some of the great Gerald Horne books that are out now that you can get are Black and Red, W.E.B. Du Bois and the Afro-American Response to the Civil War. How about Communist Front, the Civil Rights Congress, 1946 through 1956. Black Liberation, Red Scare, Ben Davis and the Communist Party. Fire This Time, the Watts Uprising and the 1960s. From the Barrel of a Gun, the United States and the War Against Zimbabwe, 1965 to 1980. Published on the University of North Carolina Press. Class Struggle in Hollywood, Moguls, Mobsters, Stars, Reds, and Trade Unionists, 1930 through 1950. Published by University of Texas Press. Race Woman, The Lives of Shirley Graham Du Bois, All great books. 818-985-5735, 818-985-KPFK. Pledge your support for him writing Black and Brown, African Americans and the Mexican Revolution, 1910 through 1920, published by New York University Press in 2005. The final victim of the blacklist, John Howard Lawson, Dean of the Hollywood 10, University of California Press. The White Pacific, U.S. Imperialism and Black Slavery in the South Seas After the Civil War. Incredible book. And each and every week, Dr. Horne gives us an insight from his books and history, U.S. American history. 818-985-5735. Mau Mau in Harlem, the U.S. and the Liberation of Kenya. The Color of Fascism, Lawrence Dennis. Racial Passing and the Rise of Right-Wing Extremists in the United States. The End of Empires, African Americans and India. 818-985-5735, 818-985-KPFK. Or how about this? The Bittersweet Science, Racism, Racketeering, and the Political Economy of Boxing. The Counter-Revolution of 1836, Armed Struggle, Panthers and Communists, Black Nationalists, and Liberals in Southern California through the 60s and 70s. Jazz and Justice, Racism and the Political Economy of the Music. White Supremacy, Confronted, U.S. Imperialism and Anti-Communism versus the Liberation of Southern Africa, From Rhodes to Mandela, put out by International Publishers, 2019. Dr. Horne is a treasure, and we learn more. And if you have not heard of Dr. Gerald Horne or this show, Freedom Now, tune in every Saturday from 11 to 12 p.m. How about this book? Black Revolutionary, William Patterson and the Globalization of the African American Freedom Struggle, Race to Revolution, the U.S. and Cuba During Slavery and Jim Crow, Paul Robeson, The Artist as Revolutionary, Fighting in Paradise, Labor Unions, Racism, and Communists in the Making of Modern Hawaii, published by the University of Hawaii Press. The Color of Fascism, Black Revolutionary, The Counter-Revolution of 1776, Slave Resistance and the Origins of the United States of America, Race to Revolution, the U.S. and Cuba During Slavery, Blows Against the U.S. Empire, Imperialism in Crisis, put out by International Publishers. 818-985-5735, 818-985-KPFK. Call now or pledge online at kpfk.org. Back to the show.
For KPFK Pacifica Radio, this is Gerald Horne, and with me on the line is Christina Greene, Professor Emerita at the University of Wisconsin at Madison, and author of the book Free Joan Little, The Politics of Race, Sexual Violence, and Imprisonment. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Professor Greene.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us. So who was Joan Little, and why did you choose to write a book about her?
Well, Joan Little, the piece that I focus on in this book is a case that received both national and international attention. She was a young Black impoverished woman imprisoned in a rural North Carolina jail in the 1970s. And in 1974, a white jailer came into her jail cell and allegedly sexually assaulted her. She fought back. He brought an ice pick into the jail cell. She used it to defend herself and escaped. A few days later, after North Carolina invoked a Reconstruction era fugitive law that allowed anyone to shoot and kill her on sight, she turned herself in. Within no time, she was indicted for first-degree murder, which at that time in North Carolina, if convicted, would mean an automatic death penalty in North Carolina's gas chamber. The case went to trial a year later in 1975, and she miraculously was acquitted. And the case gained national and international attention around a variety of issues, which we can talk about if you like.
So who was Clarence Thurgood, and did he have supporters?
Right. Clarence Thurgood was the jailer, the white jailer who came into her jail cell that night. She's a young, 20-year-old young woman. He's a 62-year-old white male, about twice her size. And he did receive a fair amount of support, particularly locally. The local newspaper initially left out any details around any sexual encounters and sort of painted him as this kind of heroic victim of a ruthless young woman. And the prosecution attempted to paint her as a Jezebel, luring an unsuspecting white man into her cell with promises of sex with the intention of escaping. And that was pretty much the narrative that a lot of the local press went with. They sort of revised some of that later as more details came out. But that was the sort of the gist of the case. And he did receive support. He had a lot of family in that area. One of the interesting things that I found in interviewing Joanne, and I actually met her brother, was the repercussions of the trial on the family. She was the oldest of 9 children in this family, and her siblings and her whole family really faced all kinds of repercussions. In particular, her siblings faced a lot of harassment and hostility in school because he had relatives who were employed in the local school. So we often forget about the ripple effects that these kinds of cases have on families and wider communities. But he did have support. The judge also received, in the case, received all kinds of letters from around the country because it received such wide press attention, all kinds of letters of support for him. But she also garnered lots of support, as I said, both nationally and internationally.
Now, domestically, who flocked to her banner? Was it the NAACP? I think you mentioned her lawyer, Jerry Paul. Was it the National Conference of Black Lawyers? Who were her supporters?
Yes, all of the above. Jerry Paul was a young white lawyer also from Eastern North Carolina, from the town she was from, and he had already garnered a reputation for defending Black activists and Black youth, and he sort of headed up her legal team. There was another young Black woman fresh out of law school, one of the first, if not the first woman to graduate, Black woman to graduate from Duke Law School, and this was her first case, Karen Bethea Shields. She was Karen Galloway at the time. And so they headed up her legal team. But she attracted all kinds of support, most notably from Black women locally. There was a group called Action for Forgotten Women, which was organizing around prison conditions in women's prison in Raleigh, North Carolina. But it also attracted support from the Black Lawyers organization that you mentioned, the SCLC, the Black Panther Party, the National Organization for Women. There were local groups formed. There was a Concerned Women for Justice for Joan Little, which was made up of a group of seasoned Black women activists, some from the Black left dating back to the 1940s, some local women who had been involved in civil rights and Black power movements locally. She also attracted support from groups like the National Black Feminist Organization, Third World Women's Alliance. So a whole array of groups and individuals really rallied behind her.
So who was Robert Martin, and what role does he play in your book?
Right. Well, one of the things, I mean, this was the book. It's not a biography, right? This is a book about really the kinds of activism that this case spurred. And I can talk a little bit more about that later. But one of the things that I discovered in interviewing Joan Little was that she had, and I knew there was some evidence of this in the trial records as well, but I delved into that a little bit more deeply. Her experiences in the criminal punishment system prior to this legendary trial, which was quite atypical in a way, to think that this, a young Black woman, is acquitted from murdering a white jailer in self-defense was quite remarkable. But her experiences in the criminal legal system prior to this trial were far more typical. And Judge Martin presided over the felony theft trial that landed her in the jail to begin with. She was awaiting appeal on a conviction. And when I looked more closely at that trial, and also talking to Karen Bethea Shields about the case, because Jerry Paul and Karen Bethea Shields took on her appeal in that felony theft case once the rape murder trial was over. There were all kinds of problems with that case. One of the most egregious was the sentencing that she got. She got a 2-year consecutive, I think it was a 7 to 10 year sentence. And rather than concurrent, these were consecutive, meaning she'd have to serve 2 sentences of 7 to 10 years. And this was, as her lawyer explained to me, this was an extraordinarily harsh sentence for a non-violent first-time offender. And Joanne had been picked up a number of times before that. She had one minor shoplifting charge that she was given a probation for. The others were dismissed. And she had also been sent to what they called a training school, which was a euphemism for juvenile jail, really, when she was a teenager, and she'd escaped from there. And I found studies done at the time that showed that once a young person, and this will resonate, I think, with your listeners today, once a young person or anybody enters the criminal legal system, they are often targeted, and particularly for young, for Black youth in places like North Carolina and throughout the country. So once she enters this legal system, and it was really for kind of, she was a truant, and she would, sneak out at night and, things like that. And so she was, sentenced to this training school. And so she received, her telling of it was that she received a lot of harassment from local police. And she told me at one point that the sheriff said to her after one of the cases was dismissed, and he said, "I'm going to get you." Now, I have no way of knowing if that was the case, but it almost doesn't matter, because again, when I looked closely at how she was treated in the criminal punishment system, as well as other studies that buttress the kinds of racial discrimination, particularly against Black youth, that was rampant, the kinds of sentencing they received. The other thing that she received from Judge Martin was she was denied what was called CYO status, or committed youth offender status. And that meant that a young person, a minor, so anyone under 21, which she was, would be eligible for parole for good behavior within, I think it was like the first year or something, or maybe right away, actually. I have to look back at the details of that. So there were all kinds of ways in which she was denied treatment that, say, a more privileged white defendant might have received. The other thing that's important to understand about Judge Martin is that he was the judge who presided over the notorious Wilmington 10 trial, which had occurred shortly before that, in which a number of civil rights activists were arrested and imprisoned and given exceedingly harsh sentences. They were eventually exonerated, meaning that no crime had committed, in the 2000s as Governor Bev Perdue left office in North Carolina. I think it was 2009, something like that. He also had presided over another trial that had gained a lot of publicity in Oxford, North Carolina, written about, some of your listeners may know about Tim Tyson's Blood Done Sign My Name memoir about a racially motivated murder that took place shortly before, again, right around the same time as Joan Little's trial, a little bit before, a few years before. And this was a case in which several white men shot and killed an unarmed young black Vietnam veteran. And it was not a murder mystery. There were all kinds of witnesses, and yet they were acquitted. So this was the judge that was presiding over her case. So again, when I began to look into this case and her treatment prior to the notorious case, there was a whole other sort of backstory to what lands her in the jail to begin with, and then the unfolding of this more legendary rape murder case that received so much attention.
So talk to us about the North Carolina Women's Prison. Were there rebellions at that site? And what percentage of the inmate population happened to be of African ancestry?
Right. I don't recall the exact numbers, but there were disproportionate numbers and percentages of Black women in the prison relative to their percentage in the general population. Again, not unlike what we're seeing today. And yes, there had been a series of protests against a wide variety of really pretty awful conditions in the women's prison, and this was where Joanne was held. The trial was moved from Eastern North Carolina, her rape murder trial, to Raleigh, North Carolina. Her lawyers were able to secure a change of venue, meaning they could change the trial, arguing that there was all kinds of racial discrimination in the jury pool, the way jury pools were selected in Eastern North Carolina. So they were able to move it to Raleigh, and she was imprisoned in what they called women's prison in Raleigh, North Carolina, waiting. First, she spent about close to 6 months while her supporters raised bail. And there had been a group of Black women had formed an organization called Action for Forgotten Women, and they had been trying to draw attention to what was going on, and they had held some demonstrations and protests around conditions in the prison. And a sit-in occurred in June of 1975. Joanne was not in the prison at the time. She was out on bail, and she was trying to raise money and publicity for her case. But she talked about one of the things she herself used her case to try to draw attention to the conditions that women faced in prison, and specifically the issue of sexual abuse and vulnerability. And there was a protest, and it turned violent. The women were, it was a peaceful protest. It was a multiracial protest, which was interesting. White women were involved in it too. I think there were some indigenous women who were also imprisoned, much smaller number. And they also published a fascinating booklet, which is available in special collections around the country. There's one at Duke. There's another copy of it at the Wisconsin Historical Society, and I think you can get it online. And it's called "Break the Chains of U.S. Legalized Slavery," and it was written by the women who had been involved in this protest. One of the things that happened was that they arrested they sent the ring. Well, they were already in prison, so they sent the ringleaders to various prisons around the state, often to men's prison, which just increased their vulnerability to sexual violence. This was a common tactic that authorities often used against activists, and that they would send them to various prisons, but it sometimes had it was a double-edged sword, because what would happen was these activists would be sent to other prisons, and then they would do organizing there. So, and before this, there had been something called the North Carolina Prisoner Labor Union, which had been organized in 1968 following a violent, a protest that turned deadly against Black male prisoners in North Carolina. And that group also rallied behind Joan Little. So there was one of the things that people had not really focused on in talking about her story was the impact that this has on prison organizing. And so that was another thing that I wanted to look at in this book.
So what happened to Joan Little after her acquittal?
Right. Well, she gets sent back to prison because she has to serve out those 2 consecutive terms that Judge Martin had imposed on her. She escapes again from this prison, from women's prison, and she heads north. There's a former boyfriend apparently turns her in, and there's a high-speed chase through Brooklyn, and she's captured, and there's a long extradition fight between North Carolina and New York. Her supporters, many of the same who had rallied behind her during the rape-murder trial, claimed that her life was in danger because of this high-profile trial and the fact that she had killed a white jailer. And so there was this long fight. I actually remember that. I was young, but I went to a demonstration in support of her in New York City. This would have been in the late 1970s, 78, 79. And she loses the extradition fight and gets sent back to North Carolina. North Carolina basically wants to get rid of her. And as she tells the story, they kind of whisk her out of jail in the middle of the night, put her on a plane, and send her out of the state. They sort of like good riddance, which is very unusual because, as I'm sure your listeners know, that when people receive parole or probation, they're usually required to stay in the same location. But I think North Carolina, this had brought such bad publicity to their state that I think they just wanted to get rid of her. She manages to, has a difficult life. She's in and out of jobs. While she was in jail, her mother died. She ends up raising a number of her siblings. She manages to get some education, and interestingly, at some point, she ends up providing health care for incarcerated women. So it's very interesting how in some ways her life trajectory kind of comes full circle. And I'm sure her experiences of incarceration and the trauma that she endured shaped, her ability to provide health care for incarcerated women.
Finally, Christina Greene, author of the book Free Joan Little, what was the impact of this case on subsequent developments, such as the Violence Against Women Act out of the U.S. Congress, such as the 1994 crime bill, to cite 2 examples?
Right. Well, what's interesting is that legislation, as we know, is also another double-edged sword. In fact, I think both President Clinton and at the time Vice President and then later Vice President and President Biden apologized for that crime bill because we know what happened. This sort of increased the power of the carceral state and had a terrible impact on communities of color and especially young people in those communities. And the Violence Against Women Act, you could say, was one of the sort of brighter pieces of that legislation. But that was also a double-edged sword in a way too, and it has undergone a number of revisions since it was passed. And I think it's gotten a lot better. And even the critics of it, people like Beth Ritchie, for example, who's a kind of prominent anti-violence Black feminist activist and scholar, was people like her, Angela Davis, other folks, Mariam Makaba, another prison activist, have been very critical of that legislation, but many of them agree that they don't want it to disappear because it does provide some services. But one of the problems was that it really looked to carceral solutions to violence against women. And one of the things that I look at in this book is the way in which this case sort of shaped women's anti-violent activism, and particularly Black women and other women of color, who had a much more sort of capacious understanding of what protection for women entails, right? And so, and for very often for these communities, calling the police was the last resort, that the police were not seen as somebody that would be offering help. And so they had a much more, a broader vision and analysis of what protection entailed. And they looked at things like, adequate shelter and transportation and childcare, and sort of a lot of the things that progressives are still fighting for. We can argue even more so right now. I mean, all of these things are under terrible threats right now, and so that Violence Against Women Act really, looked to, sort of increasing prison sentences and things like that, and again did not often meet the needs of the most vulnerable people who were victims and survivors of sexual abuse.
Well, Professor Greene, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there, but thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Thank you very much for having me.
In closing, we'd like to thank our guests, author Scott W. Stern and Professor Christina Greene from the University of Wisconsin in Madison. Shout out to Dr. Gerald Horne for doing what he does best and guiding this train of mental liberation towards Pan-African enlightenment for yet another Saturday. Word to producer Sister Tej. Much love to our spiritual backbone and Freedom Now founder Papa Didan Kamathi. Shout out to our marvelous engineer, and last, but certainly not least, thanks to all of our loyal listeners and supporters. This station is an essential resource in your life, whether it is reliable information that you can use or joyful music that inspires your community. This station provides you with programming that you rely on. You are an essential part of this station too, so just so you know, listeners provide the funding that keeps the news, information, and arts alive. Listeners' money fuels the station's power to operate. If you are going to continue to count on this station, please remember its staff and volunteers count on you. Your contribution this hour enables this essential resource to provide vibrant radio, and here's how you can help. To make your pledge, call 818-985-5735. That's 818-985-KPFK. Or go online to kpfk.org. This has been Brother Brandon Sankara, and you can join us on Facebook at Freedom Now Gerald Horne. You can email the program at freedomnow@kpfk.org or go online to our audio archives at kpfk.org. Scroll down to find Freedom Now, and you'll be able to hear this program as well as 60 days worth of prior programming here at KPFK 90.7 FM. We now send you off to our sister Assumpta with Spotlight Africa, coming up next addressing issues facing Mama Africa. And until next Saturday, here at Freedom Now, we stand running our marathon, ready for revolution.
We state these facts only to let you know that those of us who are revolutionary, Pan-Africanists, is not because we love revolution. It is historically determined, and we have no alternative but to follow history and to use history for the benefit of our people.